Hi, I'm Meshal Malik and you're watching Indus Special. Two elderly men have been seriously injured after an 84-year-old man opened fire on them in a mosque in the southwestern city of Bayonne in France. The police have arrested the perpetrator and the French President Emmanuel Macron has strongly condemned the attack. President Macron stated that everything will be done to punish the perpetrators and protect our compatriots of the Muslim faith. Now, it's important to keep in mind that this attack comes at a time when rights groups and analysts are observing a general increase in anti-Muslim attacks in European and Western spheres. For instance, the Organization Against Islamophobia in France finds that Islamophobic attacks increased by 52% in 2018 compared to in 2017. In the UK, Tell Mama, an organization which monitors hate crimes, found that after the New Zealand Christchurch attacks in March, hate crimes against Muslims increased by a 600% in the UK. On today's episode, we take an in-depth look at what is fueling this rise in attacks and what can and should be done to bring about change. Joining us for this discussion is Farid Hafez. Hafez is known for his work on Islamophobia. In 2010, he founded the Islamophobia Studies Yearbook, and in 2015, he created the European Islamophobia Report. He joins us from Vienna. We're also joined by Mohamed Amin, Ahmed, founder of the Average Mohamed organization, which is set up to counter ideological platforms against extremism and hate in the West. He joins us from Minneapolis. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Hafez, I'd like to begin with you. Now, give us a sense of you monitoring the situation in Europe and taking out this annual report. Do you see a very evident trend in the rise in anti-Muslim and Islamophobic attacks?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, we are looking at 33 countries. There are 39 scholars engaged in this collaborative work that we produce annually. And what we could especially see within the last few years is that there is a rise of right-wing extremist political groups that do want to act in a terrorist way. So, for instance, to give you just one or two examples, France and in Germany or in Sweden, we have a rise of different groups that work in the underground and that are planning to attack a number of people. There is a list of more than 20,000 people plus that was revealed, which was prepared by a right-wing underground group that is planning to attack politicians who are pro-immigration, that is planning to attack Muslim institutions. So there is not a lot of talk even about these institutions, and I suppose the reason behind this is because security services are still investigating. But at the same time, what is very dangerous about the information that is available to the wider public is that many of these institutions, that these underground groups do recruit people who were former policemen, former Ministry of Defense people, and so on and so forth. So I think, yes, we can see that this trend of Christchurch, and people feeling also supported by these ideas and draw on these examples, that is a serious problem that is developing.
Right. Mr. Hafez, with me, I want to bring Mr. Ahmed into this conversation. Now, Mr. Ahmed, when we're talking about Islamophobia and the rise of it, of course, it's not just restricted to Europe and the countries there. We're seeing it almost in all Western nations. And it seems that policies and laws are also being driven in order to restrict religious freedom. There was a recent law in Quebec in which the headscarf was seen to be not compatible with figures of authority. But in all of this, what do you think is the main driving force behind this rise in Islamophobia?
Well, it has been a mixture of misunderstanding and propaganda based on anti-Islamism. And what we've seen is a rise within the Muslim community, not just the Muslim community, but our Jewish community, and also our people of color community getting attacked by racism, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism. Institute for Public Policy did a survey, and they found out 43% of our Muslim kids have been bullied. A quarter of the bullying is done by teachers and adults. It is also stated that 23% of the Jewish community expected and received bullying. So this is not something that is a phenomenon that only affects Muslims. Here in Minnesota, in the US of A, a city refused to build a mosque. The Department of Justice came in and sued them and forced them to build a mosque. Here in Minnesota, we had a mosque bombed in Bloomington, Minnesota. Again, the FBI came in and arrested the white militia movement, which is basically a white racist organization that did the bombings, and they prosecuted them. What we do know here in America is we don't care how you dress. The Constitution protects us. Because when the Constitution was being made, freedom of religion was being made, Thomas Jefferson, the founding father, used Islam as the example of a person who should be able to live in America as a free person. So we are protected by the Constitution. And our government goes out of its way and uses hate crime laws. Now, what is not covered is the insults, the daily denigrations, the daily insults to our women who wear the hijab, and the insults to the Muslim community.
Right. And you're rightly pointing here a number of things that are happening all at once, but something that I want to talk in greater depth about, and I will take this question to Mr. Hafez, is about how Mr. Ahmed mentioned the fact that it's not just Islam that is under attack. We're also seeing anti-Semitism on the rise. And just to cite a research, Pew Research Center stated that from 2007 to 2017, government restrictions on religion, laws, policies, and actions have increased. What macro factors do you think are contributing to governments becoming more stringent on religious matters?
Well, I think, first of all, there is a difference between what is going on in Europe and what is going on in the United States or North America writ large. Secondly, I think when it comes to the issue of Islamophobia, I fully agree with the gentleman that Islamophobia is just one problem in a larger picture. So there is a problem not only with Muslims that is constructed, with all minorities, right? And there is a class problem, and there is a problem of a socio-economic deprivation of so many people. So it is a puzzle, a part of a puzzle that is a bit bigger picture. And I think when it comes to religion and the issue of the restriction of religion, yes, what the gentleman just said, in terms of the United States, the Constitution, would protect the religious freedom. And I think we just have in Europe a very different narrative of what religion means in the public space, of how religion can be accommodated. And therefore it is much easier, what I see in European countries, that the religious freedom of the Muslim group is restricted in so many ways. And again, this is not only the case for Muslims, it's also very often the case for the Jewish community. And I think what really has to be understood at this point of time, and I think really the terrorist attacks against people. Let's take the politician in Germany that was killed, Mr. Lübcke, a few months ago in his private home by a far-right terrorist. This shows us that what is really in danger is the whole of the society. And I think this is something that people are getting to understand, while many people have said it 10 years ago when they started talking about Islamophobia. We see people are step by step understanding that Islamophobia is a challenge.
Right, Mr. Hafez, keeping with everything that you're mentioning here, I want to pick up on a very integral point you stated while you were answering my question. And I'm going to take that to Mr. Ahmed. Now, Mr. Hafez pointed out that there are differences in ways religion is treated in European spheres and in Western spheres, especially in North America. Is that something you would agree with as well?
Yes. The Europeans are obsessed about how our Muslim women dress. We in America don't care. You can dress up as much as you want or dress as little as you want. As far as we are concerned, it's none of our business. That is the American way. And the freedom of religion is very integral to the American framework of thinking, because this country was started by Christians who are fleeing persecution from Europe. Again, today we're seeing in Europe, they're trying to ban the hijab, the niqab, they're trying to ban certain aspects of Islam, and they're doing it even in Canada, in
Mr.
Quebec.
Ahmed, but here I will interject once again and quote that example of Quebec, which is, of course, in Canada, not in the European sphere, in which there was a secularism legislation passed, in which hijab was seen to be something that was not compatible with those women who were in positions of authority. So it's not just an issue restricted to Europe. We are seeing rise in hate attacks against Muslims in the United States as well.
But what happens is the answers is what we are learning so far here as the Muslim community in America is making alliances with our Jewish community, our people of color, our people of faith. And together we are putting up a brave face and a brave suggestion to go about going against it. Now, our government is not neutral. The FBI, the Department of Justice, and the Department of Homeland Security do take seriously the impact of Islamophobic incidents which break the law, and they prosecute them. And that is an amazing thing here we have in America.
Right. So in your opinion, whatever is happening in the United States is much better to what is happening in Europe in terms of how minorities are treated. Am I correct?
Well, from what I'm reading, it looks like it.
All right. Mr. Hafez, the opinion of Mr. Ahmed. He believes that the United States, in a way, is much better off than Europe. But I do want to go and talk about the political leaders that are in power. Now, we're talking about right-wing leaders and the rhetoric that they give out. Donald Trump, the president of the United States, doesn't have a great track record in promoting a tolerant society. In all of this, how much of a role do you feel like political rhetoric is playing into anti-Semitism and Islamophobia that we're witnessing today?
Well, a lot. And not only rhetoric, but also the political acts, the legislation that is implemented. But I think, again, here, the big difference between the United States on one side and most of the European countries on the other side is that the federal government in the United States is much weaker than the federal government is in most nation states in Europe. And therefore, if a political power, a group comes to power that is very racist and very anti-Muslim, anti-Jewish, then that really means something. And it translates into actions very soon and has a real impact in the lives of the people at a much larger stage. So I think this is really what is crucial in the difference. And obviously, I mean, what we have just been discussing in terms of the idea of religious freedom and what it means, and that it implies that the individual is free and protected against the state, the idea of liberalism in the United States versus the idea of the concept in European nation states that has much more of a power to frame the personal life of people, coming from a welfare state system and so on and so forth. So yes, going back to your initial question, does it play a role? Yes, absolutely, because I think at the end of the day, it's really not the people who have the sentiments, but they develop the sentiments based on a certain kind of discourse that we are witnessing. And this discourse comes from those people who are in power. And those people who are in power, that's the politicians, that's the media that frames specific discourses on Muslims, Jews, people of color, and other minorities.
Right.
So yes, I think...
Hafez, keeping with everything that you're saying here, I do want to put this question to you. Aren't we assuming in all of this that the community at large is passive? That politicians, whatever they say, is just embedded in the minds of the people and they're not challenging what is happening?
Well, again, I think there is one important aspect that we have to bring into this discussion, and that's the question of resources. Well, you might find in some countries in Europe, like let's say Great Britain, a very vibrant Muslim community that is also socioeconomically well off. While in most other European countries, you will find people, the post-colonial subject that came as poor working people that are still at the lower sections of the society in terms of socioeconomic well-being. So this also plays into the abilities of these groups, how they can defend themselves. So while in the United States and let's say Great Britain, in the Anglo-Saxon world, Muslim communities are much better off, comparable to that, I think they are much less well off in most of the European countries. And I think that's also one of the explanations of why we see the situation being such in Western European countries versus Anglo-Saxon countries.
Right. I take your there. Mr. Ahmed, going back to you. Now, your organization works to counter the ideology of Islamophobia. Give us a sense of how you work towards doing that.
Well, we created a message working with kids, and we asked kids, what do you want to say about Islamophobia? And what they say is simple. Number one, we're human beings. We deserve respect. We don't need to be chastised. Number two, we reserve the right to live our lives the way we want to live our lives because pursuit of happiness is a constitutional guarantee in America. Number three, we will work with institutions, agencies, schools, teachers, educators, faith leaders, and everyone else to build an alliance, and we are building an alliance. He was right, Mr. Hafez, when he said America has a different class of Muslims. We are highly educated, very highly educated here in America as the Muslim community. We are the model community in terms of crime, and we are also highly mobile, and we are highly organized and highly political, meaning that we get our voices out. And that is what European Muslims must work on. Build alliances, build interfaith alliances, make friends with the Jews because the Jew is facing the same condition that the Muslim is facing today from these white supremacists. And we're making cause with them, and we're breaking bread with them, and we're going together to go against this Islamophobia and anti-Semitism together. This is what we're seeing in America. This is what has worked for us, and this is what we prefer our European brothers and sisters to do.
Right. Mr. Ahmed, give us an example how you're stating here that building stronger ties with the Jewish community there, of course, helps. Give us a sense of how integral interfaith practices, interfaith capacity building exercises are when you're trying to understand the ideology of hate and trying to tackle it.
I'll give you a very good example. I was invited to a Jewish synagogue where I had to read out to the congregation how to say welcome to our house, in Somali and in Arabic. At the same time, too, we host Jewish community in our mosques, whereby we celebrate their holidays like Hanukkah. At the same time, too, when issues like, for example, when the travel ban happened for Muslims, and Muslims were told not to come to America, it was the Jewish synagogue which organized lawyers to come to the airport and defend Muslims. Again, when it came to issues of Islamophobia affecting our community, it is the Jewish community that stands up and defends us. When there's a terrorist act committed by a Muslim, it is the Jewish community and the Christian community and the Sikh community and the Buddhist community who stand up front and center and they say this is not Islam. In other words, we are working together to build a society we want. Now, is there Islamophobia? Yes. Does it exist? Yes. Is it increasing? Yes. But then again, we do also have the tools and the laws and the position to counter it here in America. Now, in Europe, I don't see that happening.
Right. Mr. Hafez, something Mr. Ahmed mentioned here was the travel ban in the United States when Muslims were discouraged from entering when they were from many countries. Trump came in and said that these countries are banned from traveling to the United States. Now, when we hear about Islamophobia, it often comes with the word xenophobia. Why do you think these two issues are often conflated?
Well, in my understanding of what Islamophobia constitutes, Islamophobia is nothing else but anti-Muslim racism, as much as anti-Semitism is nothing else but anti-Jewish racism. And this is how I understand it. I think also, if you look at the white supremacist, he won't make a difference between if you're a Jew, if you're a Muslim, if you're black, if you're brown, if you're yellow, or whatever. For those people, everything that is not white is condemned as being evil and is seen as below the hierarchy and the top position of white people. So that's my understanding of Islamophobia. Islamophobia is basically not about religion, it's about racism. It's not about Muslims and how Muslims do and what Islam is and if Islam is good or bad or whatever. It has more to do with what the racist thinks that he is at this point of time countering the so-called Islamic threat or the Jewish threat or whatever kind of threat,
right,
rather than it has to do that it was related to Muslims and Islam.
Right. Mr. Ahmed, now that same point that we were talking about, that it's often conflated with those migrants or immigrants coming into a country, those individuals are seen to be targets. Now, all of this brings into the question of what it means to be American or what it means to be European, that there is a distinct identity, a prototype that those people who come must identify with or must assimilate into the community. Do you feel like after the United States, President Donald Trump came into power, when his rhetoric became more aggressive, do you think that identity, what it means to be American, it changed?
Well, actually, no. It basically made us stronger. Let me explain why. Our identity got accepted. Now, despite what our government says when it comes to immigration, 67% of Americans still believe in immigration. They still believe in the melting pot that is called America. More Americans believe in the values of intercommunal cohabitation and coexistence. Now, assimilation has gotten a bad word to it. Assimilation does not mean abandoning our culture and our religion. It actually means expanding our culture to basically fit in within our new communities and our new understanding and our new horizons. That has happened with every immigrant community to every new community. It doesn't matter whether you go to Pakistan or you go to America or you go to Britain. It all is the same. You will pick up some new values, and there are some old values which will not work within a new society. That is happening within our communities. What we can tell you is this: the force against anti-Semitism, the force against Islamophobia is gathering steam in America. It basically used to be the media used to only show Muslims doing bad stuff only. When the Muslim blows up something, is the only time they showed Muslims. Now we're getting more Muslim visibility in the media, and that is changing mindsets. You have to understand, majority Americans have never met or talked to a Muslim. So all they know about us is what the media portrays. The media plays an important role in terms of defining our community, and we are engaging it, such as my organization of Average Mohamed, to talk about it. And we're engaging our non-Muslim community because what really drove this Islamophobia is September 11th, when 19 Muslims killed 3,000 Americans.
So in all of this, Mr. Ahmed, you're stating very clearly that it is the media responsible for creating this image, which is propagated again and again, and then is cemented into the minds of those who perpetuate hate. What do you think needs to be done differently?
Well, we speak to media. We tell media at all times, whenever there's a Muslim act of aggression or extremism, put on a Muslim who is countering that effort, because you need a balanced view. Majority Muslims don't believe in this. Majority Muslims just want to coexist. All we care about is we want peace. We just want to raise our kids, just want to feed our kids, and we want our kids to have healthcare and a good education and a good opportunity. That is universal. Now, once you understand that about our Muslim community, then we are the same as all.
Sorry to interrupt here, but I take your point. And since we're running short on time, I do want to get a last comment from Mr. Hafez here. Mr. Hafez, when we're talking about all of this, and we have talked about the different factors that are fueling the rise in Islamophobia and many restrictions on religion, something I do want to talk about is fringe networks, and especially social media networks like 8chan and all these other organizations operating. How much of a role are they playing in perpetuating hate amongst people?
All right. Well, I think, the issue here is, I think social media is not a factor in itself. Social media is a tool for different groups. And I think one of the things that we can observe, even beyond the issue of Islamophobia, but just in general, that we have certain political groups, while in the past we had like something called mainstream media. And if you want to have media attention, then you have to play the rules of this media, right? Now it's like every political group has its own channels, with social media reaches the people on their own terms, and they don't have to relate to a wider discourse. So it's also a fracturing of different discourses. And this is also creating like new communities, digital communities within society. And overall, I think this also creates many problems and challenges in terms of how can we still have a dialogue all together with each other, right? It helps definitely those fringe right-wing groups to be able to bring their message specifically designed for their electorate, for their potential listeners, to try and convince them. And it creates a problem for the whole of the society, for the cohesion of the society, how we can still have a dialogue all together. And I think this is really what is a problematic trend when we speak about social media and the fracturing of our societies.
Right. On that, thank you so much, Mr. Farid Hafez, for joining us from Vienna, and Mr. Mohamed Amin Ahmed from joining us from Minneapolis. We're going to take a short break. When we return, we're going to continue our discussion. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show. While we discuss the rise of Islamophobia and what are the factors causing it to rise, what is fueling it. Joining us now for this discussion is Yasser, who's the head of the Justice and Liberties for All Committee in France, an organization which works for the defense of human rights and civil liberties. He joins us from Istanbul. We're also joined by Mr. Hijra Saputra, who's an analyst, joining us from Kingston. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Yasser, I'd like to begin with you. Now, we were talking a lot about the factors that are causing for an influence of people, why hate is spreading amongst them. In all of this, I want to understand how important is it for states to create a narrative in which there is a very clear antagonist, and in this case, Muslims being the antagonist?
Well, in the case of France, and as a matter of fact, for almost all Western countries that have a colonial past, Muslims, whether they are coming from Africa, the Middle East, or South Asia, or even Southeast Asia, have always been perceived as a population to either exploit for economic gains, to use for the wars being waged by those countries. And when they were, quote unquote, welcomed on the Western source, especially in France, they were expected not to ask for the same rights as the majority population. Now, when we say the rise of Islamophobia, I think we are about 30 years late with this term. Now, Islamophobia has settled, at least in the case of France, because Islamophobia has been allowed to become part of the law. Many laws are specifically targeting Muslims today. And what has making things even blatant and even worse today with this rise of white supremacy terrorism is that the anti-Muslim rhetoric is no longer being carried by the far right or the usual suspects, the neo-fascists, etc. Now it's being carried by the left, political parties, the Socialist Party, and even today, Emmanuel Macron, who has been giving this idea that he's somehow the shining liberal standing against Trump. But Emmanuel Macron is doing the exact same thing as Trump, demonizing Muslims on the one hand and using them as scapegoats because of social upheaval in France. In other words, because he has been unable to tackle rising inequalities and poverty in France, he's now using what I call Islamodiversion. You create a Muslim problem to divert public opinion.
Right. And you're mentioning many points, and I want to get to them one by one, but I'll start with the point you mentioned earlier in which you linked Islamophobia to the colonial past. Do you think European states, specifically those who were colonizers, are recognizing their attitudes, that the post-colonial legacy still continues in this way?
Well, actually, it's even worse than that. We have had laws passed in parliament that are calling to praise the colonial era because it was, quote unquote, an era of civilizing the savages and bringing technology and freedoms to the barbaric peoples of Africa and Asia. So today there is even a sense of pride on the one hand if you are from the right, and if you are from the center parties or the mainstream parties, it's about saying, well, that's part of the past. The problem is that the French Republic, as we know it today, the so-called Fifth Republic with the 1958 Constitution, was actually a pure product of the colonial era. And it was passed in the midst of the bloody repression of Algerians while they were seeking independence. Now, all the authoritarian measures adopted in the French Constitution today are applied against blacks, Arabs, browns, and as a matter of fact, the whole Muslim population. either to keep them away from access to public education, from healthcare, from housing, and now being used as the enemy within. What's really troublesome with this is that France has a near history of, massacring the Jews using the term the enemy within, and not learning from the past what has been applied to Jews in terms of demonization and calling them the enemy within and passing laws of exception. Today is being used against Muslims, and not by a far-right government, by a centrist or center-right government like that of Emmanuel Macron and François Hollande, a socialist president, just 2 years before that.
Right. Yasser, I'm going to get back to you and talk to you about the point you mentioned about how Muslims are being used as scapegoats for many of the problems we're seeing right now. But before that, I want to bring Hijra into this conversation. Hijra, following from what Yasser is talking about, how an enemy within is created, do you feel like that's something that you can relate to with your experiences, with your observations, that Muslims are seen to be the enemy within?
Yes, kind of. The Islamophobia and things. It's started with the issue that, to hate Muslim and then to blame Muslim with something that really, really not related to the Islam and Muslim itself. So, for example, I don't know how it happened. We need to understand why, for example, Islamophobia it's happened. For example, this is like, I don't know, like Western, for example, government and state is like put Islam as to be as the enemy.
Right. So Hijra, as you're mentioning here, that it is important to trace the reasons as to why this is happening, I'd like to show a video of the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan, the speech he gave in the United Nations General Assembly, in which he highlighted the issue of Islamophobia, and he put across a point in which he felt, and which many nations feel, is the reason why it's increasing. Let's take a listen to it.
Certain Western leaders equated terrorism with Islam, Islamic terrorism. Radical Islam. What is radical Islam? There is only one Islam, and that is the Islam we follow of Prophet Mohamed sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There is no other Islam. Terrorism has nothing to do with any religion.
So, Yasser, from what the Prime Minister here stated in a very assertive manner, that religion has nothing to do with terrorism, and that the reason for Islamophobia is because many world leaders equated terrorism with Islam. Now, here I want to understand, what are the motives of states when they do something like this? You earlier mentioned the term scapegoats and using Muslims as scapegoats. Does this relate to any of this?
Well, first, we have to remember that Western interventions in Muslim countries have created the various terrorist groups we have seen in the past 20 years. They were not manufactured by Muslims themselves, that be it British for intelligence or the US or France, they have all used all kinds of groups to either destabilize countries or destroy countries like Iraq, and with the power vacuum leading to the emergence of various terrorist groups, quoting, for example, Daesh between Iraq and Syria. Now, these Western powers, instead of them taking their responsibilities as so-called leaders of the free world, they are blaming their respective Muslim minorities for the foreign policies and the disastrous foreign policies they are leading, over which Muslims have no control over whatsoever. Now, when they call, for example, and say radical Islam, I'm going to refer, for example, to the French Senate, and they admit officially that they have no definition of the word radicalization, and they do admit, quote unquote, I spoke about it in my report of 2017 on Islamophobia in France, that the term has been adopted under the pressure of current events. Now, you don't see the word radicalization being applied, for example, against white supremacy terrorists. You don't see the word radicalization being applied to Israel, to Jewish youngsters joining the Israeli army.
And Yasser, here's sorry to interrupt, but here's where I want to push this question. Why is it that this is also equated when we see terrorist attacks committed by white supremacists, white nationalists, and at an increasing frequency? Why is there this double standard? What narratives are allowing for this double standard to exist?
Because, you quoted, you spoke about, and I thank you for that, white supremacy. Well, that's what it is. It's supremacy, which means the evil and evildoers are not part of us. It's always the other side. So, for example, 3 years ago, the socialist president François Hollande tried to change the French constitution and to allow the French state to strip of their citizenship terrorists and, of course, people who are identified as radical Muslims from their French citizenship, in a sense that if they do evil, they are not part of us. So today, we see that the so-called counter-terrorist measures are only applied for two reasons. Of course, to speak to public opinion and say, look at what we are doing, we are targeting those bad terrorists. Of course, those terrorists are always Muslims. They cannot be white folks joining, for example, various white supremacy militias. And the second one, we have to look even beyond the measures being applied. For example, France and many Western countries are sitting on social time bombs, and they are expecting an outburst of social unrest. Now, for the French state to be able to jugulate and mitigate those social upheavals, as we are seeing it, for example, with the Yellow Vest movements, the state needs extraordinary powers. Now, they're not going to say, we need extraordinary powers to beat down your kids when they march for employment and decent wages. No, we are seeking extraordinary powers because those evil Muslims are challenging our peace. Now, problem is that the white majority population, be it in the UK, France, or the US, for example, they feel safe as long as their governments are targeting Muslim minorities. But at the end of the day, once you pass a law, the law is applied against everybody. So we have here, to sum things up, two points we have to highlight. The first one being that we are moving towards authoritarian liberalism, which means we're going to have neoliberal policies being applied by authoritarian states. And the second one, we need to constantly challenge public opinion by telling them the problem is not us ripping you off your benefits and allowing tax evasion, etc., but your Muslim neighbor who's wearing a headscarf and therefore a direct threat to you.
Right. Yasser, you've mentioned a number of points that are very interesting and they're worthy to pick up on and discuss them further. But the point that I do want to take to Hijra is talk to him about this threat that is being created and the narratives that are being created. In all of this, is there space for Muslims and for minorities to engage, to have meaningful discourse with those who are perpetrators of this violence, or is there any space for them to give their narrative?
Well, Meshal, it's really kind of dilemmatic when Muslim become a victim and then always be blamed and then put as the enemy. No matter what the white government, Western government try to create an image, negative image, but always Muslim around the world, they understand, and then they try to understand this is a kind of political things, and then they don't want to be reacted or provoke negatively. So Muslim around the world, it depends on the Muslim leader in their local country trying to make calm the situation and things. So this is yeah.
Right. On that point, thank you so much, Mr. Hijra Saputra, for joining us and talking to us. Yasser, just a last question to you. Now, when we're talking about all of this, and this is a question I raised earlier as well, but I do want to bring it up again. Now, Brookings had a very interesting project in which they put out a number of research papers. They were titled The 1% Problem, Muslims in the West and the Rise of the New Populist, in which they talk about how Muslims make up 1 to 8% of the population, and yet so much of the narrative is constructed around them, and they're seen to be the enemy in all of this. Are we assuming that the people, the listeners, the viewers, those in the general community are not fighting back against this political rhetoric?
Well, it depends. If you're talking about the majority population in Western countries, no, they are not, fighting or pushing back against it, because to them it's a problem specific to minorities, and because there is a rampant idea that Muslims don't belong here in France or there in the UK or in the US. To them, it's like, oh well, at best they're gonna say it's bad, but what can we do? And at worst, they're gonna be like, okay, then these Muslims are problematic, and the government is right. Now, what the majority of population misses is that you will be affected one day by what Muslims are undergoing today. And to make things even clearer for the wider audience, today Muslims in Western countries are the barometer of the state of democracy and the rule of law, because states always need a scapegoat to set a precedent. But once that precedent is accepted, it becomes applicable to everybody. Now, for example, in France, they passed the state of emergency. Yes, they passed all these violent measures against Muslims, but 3 months down the road, they applied them against environmental workers, against the anarchists, against the union leaders, and even against political opponents. So today, Muslims, because they are losing their rights and freedoms, and because people are remaining quiet, are just being the first witnesses of the rise of highly authoritarian states. And that's no coincidence that, for example, countries like India,
Yasser, now taking your point there, that is an integral point, and that's where I'm going to have to end the show since we've run out of time. But that is an important point, that the laws and regulations that are made today against one minority will, of course, subsequently impact other minorities in the future, and that is something that we're seeing unfold before our eyes. On that point, thank you so much, Mr. Yasser Latoi, for joining us. We're going to end the show. Thank you so much for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.